In early 2026, a research vessel detected a sound rising through 18,000 feet of black water from a warship that hadn't moved in over 80 years. It wasn't the groan of old metal surrendering to pressure. It was a tap followed by a scrape, repeating every few seconds, deliberate and patient. And it was coming from inside the hull. The secret mission that started it all. To understand what's happening beneath the Philippine Sea, you have to go back to the summer of 1945. The world was at war, and the United States was about to play its most devastating card. The USS Indianapolis, a heavy cruiser that had survived kamikazes and naval bombardments across the Pacific, was pulled from the front lines and given a mission so classified that even her own captain wasn't told the full truth. She was ordered to carry components of Little Boy, the atomic bomb that would be dropped on Hiroshima from San Francisco to Tinian Island. The uranium was loaded under heavy guard. Armed Marines stood watch over sealed containers that most of the crew were forbidden to look at, let alone touch. The entire operation moved at a pace that bordered on reckless. Speed was everything. There was no time for the usual convoy escorts. No destroyers flanking the ship, no air cover. The Indianapolis sailed alone across the open Pacific, carrying the key to ending the war, completely unprotected. She delivered her cargo successfully. The bomb parts reached Tinian. The mission was technically complete, but the Indianapolis never made it home. On the night of July 30th, 1945, just minutes after midnight, 2 torpedoes fired by the Japanese submarine, Hawaii 58, slammed into her starboard side. The first ripped through the bow. The second detonated a fuel tank and a magazine. The ship listed violently, and within 12 minutes, the USS Indianapolis slipped beneath the waves. Of her crew of nearly 1,200 men, roughly 900 survived the sinking and made it into the water. What followed is one of the most harrowing ordeals in naval history. Because of a catastrophic failure of communication, nobody knew the ship had gone down. No distress signal was received. No rescue was dispatched. For almost 5 days, those 900 men floated in the open Pacific, with no food, no fresh water, and no hope. The sun burned them during the day. Hypothermia set in at night. Men drank seawater and went mad. They hallucinated. They fought each other. And then, drawn by the blood and the thrashing, the sharks arrived. Oceanic whitetips, hundreds of them. The official record calls it the worst shark attack in human history. Men were pulled under in broad daylight. Others were taken in the dark, disappearing without a sound, swallowed by the black water, while their friends floated helpless beside them. By the time a patrol plane accidentally spotted the survivors on August 2nd, only 316 men were still alive. The rest were gone. Hundreds of bodies were never recovered. The Navy told the families that the sea had taken them, but the survivors told a different story. And for 80 years, almost nobody listened. Voices from the water. Here's the catch. If you sit down and actually read the first-hand accounts from the men who survived those 5 days, something doesn't add up. Yes, there were sharks. Nobody is disputing that. But mixed in with the shark accounts are descriptions that don't match any known predator in the Pacific Ocean. Multiple survivors described seeing shapes beneath them that were far too large to be whitetips, shadows that moved with a slow, deliberate glide, circling at a depth that no surface predator would occupy. Some men reported friends being pulled straight down, not sideways the way a shark drags its prey, but vertically, as though something reached up from the deep and yanked them under. There was no thrashing, no blood on the surface, no screams, just a man floating there 1 second and gone the next, as if a trap door had opened beneath him. In 1945, the Navy's medical officers documented these accounts and quietly shelved them. The official explanation was delirium. The men had been exposed to extreme heat, salt water ingestion, and psychological trauma. Hallucinations were expected, and for decades, that explanation held. Nobody questioned it. The shark narrative was horrifying enough. But now, 80 years later, a deep-sea expedition has captured footage that is forcing researchers to reconsider everything those men said. And the implications are staggering. If you're the kind of person who needs to know what's really at the bottom of the ocean, hit subscribe now. Because what the cameras found next changes everything. Descent into the abyss. The research vessel Meridian arrived at the coordinates of the Indianapolis wreck site in early 2026. The ship was equipped with the Triton IV, a next-generation remotely operated vehicle encased in a titanium shell, built to withstand the kind of pressures that would crush a submarine like a soda can. The wreck sits at roughly 18,000 feet, a depth so extreme that the water exerts over 8,000 pounds of pressure on every square inch of surface. That means an entire school bus pressing down on an area the size of your thumbnail. The Triton IV began its descent, a 4-hour journey through layers of ocean that grow progressively more alien with every passing minute. The first 1,000 feet were still tinged with blue, the last gasps of sunlight filtering through the water column. By 3,000 feet, natural light was gone entirely. The drone's external lamps carved a small tunnel of visibility through absolute darkness. By 12,000 feet, they had passed the depth of the Titanic. The water temperature hovered just above freezing. Nothing should have been alive down there, except scattered colonies of deep-sea bacteria and the occasional transparent shrimp drifting through the void. But the audio feed told a different story. The scratching sound that the Meridian's surface sensors had detected hours earlier was growing louder with every 100 feet the drone descended. It no longer sounded like the ambient creaking of old metal. It sounded rhythmic, purposeful, like something heavy being dragged across a steel floor in a slow, repeating pattern. The crew watched the depth counter climb in total silence. The Navy observers on board had stopped talking entirely. They were scribbling notes and refusing to make eye contact with anyone. And then the Indianapolis appeared on screen. The bow rose out of the silt like a ghost ship, its gun turrets still pointed forward, the hull still holding its shape. After 8 decades in the crushing dark, the team had expected a flattened ruin. Instead, they found a warship that looked almost defiant, as though the ocean hadn't fully claimed it. Lead archaeologist Dr. Elena Vasquez gripped the edge of the console and whispered something in Spanish that nobody caught. She later said it was the only time in her career that a wreck made her feel like she was being watched. But the moment of awe didn't last long, because the cameras revealed something that no one on board could explain: the marks that shouldn't exist. As the Triton IV moved along the hull, Dr. Vasquez noticed scratches. Not the kind of surface abrasions you'd expect from decades of deep-sea corrosion or the impact of the original torpedo strikes. These were long, deep gouges carved into the thick naval steel. Vertical lines, evenly spaced, running in parallel sets along the hull plating. But here is the catch. The metal inside those gouges was bright, clean, completely free of the rust and biological buildup that covered every other surface of the wreck. That can only mean one thing. Those marks were recent. Not 80 years old, not even 10 years old. Something had been scratching the hull of the USS Indianapolis within the last few months. And whatever made those marks had the raw physical strength to carve grooves into steel that was designed to survive naval combat. The scratches weren't random. They were concentrated around a specific section of the ship, the forward magazine. This was the compartment where the uranium components of the atomic bomb had been stored during the Indianapolis's secret mission to Tinian. The bomb parts were offloaded before the ship sank. The room should have been completely empty, but the scratches suggested that something was fixated on this exact area, as if it could sense a residual trace of what had once been stored there. Some researchers have proposed a theory that sounds almost too strange to be true. The uranium components may have left behind trace levels of radiation embedded in the steel. At 18,000 feet in permanent darkness, certain deep-sea organisms have evolved to detect the faintest energy signatures, electromagnetic fields, bioluminescent flickers, thermal gradients that human instruments can barely register. If the forward magazine retained even a whisper of radioactive residue, it could act as a beacon, a signal fire in the abyssal dark, drawing creatures from miles away. The Indianapolis wouldn't just be a wreck anymore. It would be a lighthouse in the deepest desert on Earth. Inside the hull, drone pilot Marcus Hale guided the Triton 4 toward the breach where the ship had broken apart, threading the machine through a gap in the torn steel. This was the most dangerous part of the entire operation. One miscalculation, one snag on a jagged edge, and they'd lose millions of dollars in equipment, along with every frame of footage they'd captured. Hale's hands were steady, but his jaw was locked tight. He later told a colleague that flying into that wreck felt less like piloting a machine and more like putting his hand inside a mouth. The drone entered the interior of the ship. Its lights swept through corridors that hadn't been touched by anything except darkness since the night the Indianapolis went down. Boots still sat on the floor. Canteens rested against bulkheads. It was a time capsule and a graveyard, frozen in the last moments of July 1945. The crew on the surface watched in respectful silence. Some of them had tears in their eyes, but the emotional weight of the moment was shattered when the audio feed changed. The rhythmic scratching that had been a background presence throughout the dive suddenly escalated into a loud, grinding noise. And it was coming from the forward magazine, the same compartment surrounded by those fresh, impossible scratches. The drone reached the entrance to the magazine, and the cameras revealed something that defied every expectation. But here is the catch. The massive steel bulkhead hadn't been blown apart. It hadn't corroded or crumbled over decades of saltwater exposure. It had been bent inward, folded, pushed aside, as though it were soft clay. The edges of the breach were smooth and clean, with no jagged tearing, no stress fractures. Whatever had forced its way through that wall had done so with a controlled, deliberate power that borders on the incomprehensible. Dr. Vasquez asked Hale to hold the drone steady on the breach for a full 30 seconds. When someone on the crew asked why, she said she needed to be sure she wasn't imagining it. Inside the magazine, the environment was completely different from the rest of the ship, where every other compartment was coated in silt and bacterial mats. This room was strangely clean. The walls were bright. The water was clear. It looked maintained, occupied. On the far side of the room, there was a second breach where something had pushed its way out, creating a tunnel straight through the ship. Acoustic technician James Okoro, monitoring the audio feeds on the surface, reported that the low hum emanating from the wreck had intensified to the point where it was vibrating the floor of the control room. He said it no longer sounded like decay or settling. It sounded like a massive tuning fork being struck repeatedly, resonating through the ship's steel skeleton and radiating outward into the surrounding water. Okoro had spent 11 years recording deep ocean soundscapes. He said he had never heard anything like it, and that the pattern suggested something biological rather than geological. Then camera 2 caught something, a flash of movement in the far corner of the magazine. Something pale and smooth darted across the edge of the frame. It didn't move like a fish. There was no tail propulsion, no undulation. It glided with a strange, almost mechanical precision that was clearly, unmistakably biological. The footage was blurry. The creature, if that's what it was, seemed to resist the drone's high-powered lights, as though its surface scattered or bent the illumination rather than reflecting it. 3 frames, that's all they captured. 3 frames of something that should not exist. Contact seconds later, the drone was struck. The screen erupted into static for 3 full seconds. When the image returned, the Triton 4 had been spun completely around. One of the high-definition cameras was destroyed. The navigation system was spinning uselessly. Marcus Hale fought to regain control, but the machine was behaving as though something was physically gripping it, resisting the thrusters, holding it in place. The low hum stopped instantly. In its place came a silence so absolute and so heavy that the crew on the surface said it felt like the ocean itself was holding its breath. The mission coordinator made the call. They were pulling the drone out. Now, James Okoro pulled off his headphones and set them on the console. His hands were shaking. He stared at the wave form frozen on his screen and said quietly enough that only the people nearest to him heard it. That wasn't a fish. Fish don't do that. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. Everyone in the control room had watched the same 3 frames. Dr. Vasquez was still standing at the monitor, her arms crossed, her face unreadable. She later admitted she replayed the footage 40 times before accepting what she was seeing. The retrieval took 6 hours. 6 hours of tension so thick that nobody on the Meridian spoke above a whisper. When the Triton 4 finally broke the surface, the Navy observers moved immediately. They ordered the crew to stop talking. They confiscated every hard drive, every data card, every piece of recorded audio. They took the smashed camera housing. They spent hours on encrypted communications with Naval Command in Hawaii. By the end of the day, the Meridian mission was officially terminated. The crew was told the equipment had malfunctioned. They were ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements and informed that discussing the dive in any capacity would be treated as a breach of national security. The official report, released weeks later, stated that the mission was a routine survey and that nothing unusual was observed, but a handful of frames from the footage leaked. 3 images showing that pale, impossible shape, and the audio, that rhythmic scraping, that deep vibrating hum rising from inside a dead warship 3.5 miles beneath the sea, was heard by enough people to ensure that the truth couldn't be buried completely. What lives in the dark? Here's what we know. The USS Indianapolis rests in one of the most extreme environments on Earth, a place where the pressure would crush a human body in an instant and where sunlight hasn't reached since before our species existed. The Mariana Trench, the deepest point in any ocean, lies just to the east. We have better maps of the surface of Mars than we do of this stretch of ocean floor. Every time we send a camera into the abyss, we find organisms that defy our understanding of biology. Creatures whose metabolisms are so slow they may live for centuries, drifting through a world that blurs the line between life and suspended animation. The deep ocean is not empty. It is ancient, patient, and vast beyond our comprehension. Now consider the Indianapolis, a 900-foot steel structure sitting on the abyssal plain like a cathedral in a desert. For 80 years, it has been radiating trace energy signatures, conducting sound through its metal skeleton, and providing structure in a world that has almost none. To a deep-sea predator, evolved to detect the faintest signals across miles of open water. The wreck wouldn't just be an object, it would be an event, a beacon, a territory worth claiming and defending. But here is the catch. We have classified roughly 230,000 marine species. Estimates suggest there may be over 2 million more that we haven't found yet, most of them in the deep, in places we've never looked, at pressures we can barely simulate in a laboratory. The bent steel, the clean room, the tunnel through the hull, thus fresh gouges in naval-grade armor, the pale shape that moved without swimming. None of it fits any species currently known to science. But that catalog of known species, it covers barely 10% of what's actually down there. The warning beneath the waves. The USS Indianapolis is a war grave. It is the final resting place of hundreds of American sailors who gave their lives in the service of their country. That fact deserves our deepest respect. But it is also something more. It is a boundary marker, a line between the world we know and the world we pretend doesn't exist. For 80 years, we've told ourselves a story about the Indianapolis that ends with sharks and rescue. It's a story that fits neatly into our understanding of the ocean as a dangerous but ultimately knowable place. The Meridian footage suggests that the real story is far stranger, far older, and far more unsettling than anything we've been willing to consider. Something is living inside that ship. Something strong enough to reshape naval steel and intelligent enough to maintain its environment. Something that was possibly there in 1945, pulling men down from below while the world blamed the sharks. The Navy's frantic secrecy, the confiscated footage, the silenced crew. None of it suggests a government that has things under control. It suggests a government that is terrified of what it found and has no idea what to do about it. The ocean covers 70% of our planet. We have explored less than 5% of it. Every time we descend into the deep, we discover that we are not the dominant species on this planet. We are surface dwellers, clinging to a thin crust of rock and air, floating above an abyss that contains more mystery than every library ever built. The USS Indianapolis is down there right now, 18,000 feet below the sunlight, sitting in the cold and the dark. And the hum hasn't stopped. Whatever is breathing in those corridors, whatever carved those marks into the steel and bent that bulkhead like paper, it's still there. It's been there longer than we've had ships, and it will be there long after our civilization has faded to dust. The ocean isn't our territory. It never was. The men of the Indianapolis learned that lesson the hardest way imaginable. The question is whether the rest of us are ready to listen. What do you think is really living 18,000 feet below the Philippine Sea? Drop your theory in the comments. Hit that like button and subscribe for more deep sea mysteries, because we are just getting started.